Hello, geography. This is Mr. Wester, and we're going to today talk about the colonialism in Africa. Remember, we're talking about political geography. Today, we're going to be looking at how kind of Africa was divided up by Europe and kind of how that has impacted Africa over time, and looking at what colonialism actually is itself. So, before we kind of get into things, let's look at some interesting facts about Africa during this time period. Advances in technology in Tanzania, Rwanda, and Uganda began between 1500 and 2000 years ago, which surpassed those of Europeans at the time. So there was nations and civilizations in Africa that were very advanced. In the 1400s, there was a West African College of Astronomy and History in Timbuktu that people traveled thousands of miles to attend. It was a very famous college of astronomy and history that was very popular throughout the world. Also, the Africans had many wealthy civilized cultures, including Ghana, Mali, Bantu, the Great Zimbabwe. This actually includes the richest man to ever live. His name was King Mansa Musa. He lived in the 14th century, and his wealth today, if you calculated it, would be worth over $400 trillion. This is known as the most wealthy person to ever be on this earth, and he was the king of Mali. So that's kind of some interesting facts as we kind of go into what colonialism is and kind of how Europe started to colonize Africa. So what is colonialism? Well, this is going to be kind of the first step to understanding what happened in Africa. Is just understanding what colonialism is. So what colonialism is the effort by one country to establish settlements in a territory and to impose its political, economic, and cultural principles on that territory. So we're going to see colonialism in action in Africa during the late 1800s and early 1900s especially. And a lot of this is going to be due to, remember, the Industrial Revolution. That's going to create countries the ability to finally look outward and look at, okay, we need more resources. We're creating a lot of produce. We're creating a lot of products. We now need to kind of shift and look for other markets that we can sell our goods to and get more resources. So they're going to start looking outside of their own nations. Europeans started colonizing the Western Hemisphere in the 1400s, but lost those colonies when in 1776, the United States declared independence, and most American or Latin American colonies followed suit between 1800 and 1824. So Europe had kind of lost its control over Latin America and the United States. So they started to shift their focus elsewhere. Instead of looking at the Western Hemisphere, they're going to be looking into the Southern Hemisphere. In 1848, 14 European nations were interested in Africa's resources, which included gold and diamonds. And we're going to see this kind of be a very strong characteristic as we look at why nations kind of go and colonize. And we'll look at those in just a second. So we're going to look at 3 reasons why nations start to colonize, why they go out into the world to kind of gain control. The first big reason is God or religion. This is a very big philosophy in regards to why people and why nations are starting to expand, is to promote their religion, whether it be Catholicism, Christianity, and some sort of that was going to be a big driving factor, or even Islam, especially in the northern African countries. We're going to see this being a very big impact on why nations are starting to expand their boundaries. Money. This is going to be a very, very, very big factor. They're looking to extract useful resources like gold, diamond, even people. During this time period, the slave trade was a very big thing and kind of roaring during a lot of this early time. So they're going to be kind of going for and going out into the other nations to get these resources. Also, power is going to be the third one we're going to talk about. To get prestige, widespread respect and admiration from other European states through the number of colonies they had. It's the glory. So you talk about God as being kind of a big one, religion promoting itself, money. Nations are trying to expand in order to gain resources, and then power to kind of like, look at me. I have all these colonies. I have all this land across the world. Look how great my nation is. Is going to be a big kind of factor in going outward and expanding and colonizing other nations. So we're going to see these three reasons as being kind of the big motives for colonization in the first place: religion, resources, and power. We look at this map, you can see a bunch of different resources that are coming about out of it. You see things like coffee, corn, cotton, dates, fruit, rubber is going to be a very big one later on, tobacco, wheat. Uh, those are kind of the things that you can grow and you can find that are natural or native to Africa. We're also going to see a lot of diamonds, mining, gold mining, all these different things that haven't been tapped into in Africa from the Europeans, and they're going to be targeting those resources. And Africa is very diverse in regards to their agriculture as well as their temperature, geology. Africa is a very, very large continent. So we're going to see a lot of different areas be very different from each other. And that's going to cause different countries to come and colonize the different parts in order to get those different resources. So, how does Europe start looking into Africa? Well, in a meeting famously known as the Berlin Conference, the European nations decided to divide and control parts of Africa to obtain these resources. So they came together, the big countries in Europe, and decided how they were going to split up Africa. They didn't want wars to happen by the Europeans to decide who wins them, so they wanted to come together beforehand and split up Africa on their own. So here's some basic facts about the conference. The first one, like I said, they wanted to avoid a potential fight. So they laid down the rules for dividing up Africa. They wanted to make sure everybody understood what was happening and how the process was going to work because they didn't want to fight with each other. They just all wanted to take advantage of the resources that were found in Africa. Number two, not one African leader was invited to the conference. So you can imagine they're splitting up this giant continent with a bunch of different nations, a bunch of different people groups. Not one of them was actually invited to the conference itself to decide who gets control of what. So the Europeans thought they were superior to the people in Africa and that they had better weapons, things like that. So the Africans themselves weren't the issue. They knew the other Europeans would be. So they wanted to make sure that other Europeans were on the same page, but didn't actually contact any African leaders. So there's no African leader involvement in any of these conferences or decide, hey, you should split up this or this. These people are independent. They don't need European rule, things like that. So it's going to be a big deal that no African leaders were actually invited. Third, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained free of European control. These are the only two nations in the continent of Africa to remain independent out of European control. And they both have different reasons. Ethiopians started getting weapons earlier than other nations. They were able to fight back, hold their ground. Liberia had a lot of people from America come back over and kind of had that independence on their own. So we're going to see those two nations really stay out of European control. Here is a map after the conference in 1980 or 1884. You're going to see each country kind of has their claim into what part of Africa they are going to kind of take as their own. And you can see how this would impact a lot of these nations. If you recognize a map of Africa before or after or modern, you're going to see it's a very different than what this is splitting up the nation to be. And we're going to talk about why and what problems that this is going to come about. All of a sudden, now this whole area is controlled by France, this by Belgium, this by Britain. How is that going to impact the people who are actually living there? What's going to happen, and how are the colonizers or the Europeans going to treat the people that are actually there, or are they only just going to go for the resources? You can see the African borders in 2015. You can see some of these states, like Sudan, is actually split up into two. So you're going to see that it's very different than what this map is. There are some that are very similar, but there's going to be a lot of nations around the coast that are going to be split up and getting rid of the Europeans' rule. So some of the issues that came about because of the Berlin Conference. Well, the European nations divided Africa with no regard to where African ethnic or language groups live. So the people who were actually there, who had set boundaries before, The European set boundaries, combined groups who were traditional enemies, it divided others who were not. So now you have Europeans with no African uh, tribal or nation really understanding, kind of splitting up Africa to kind of how they want it. All of a sudden, now, if you look at previous maps, Belgium controls this area. But what if they split up the same nation? So now all of a sudden, half of the tribe or the nation is controlled by France and half is controlled by Belgium? Or what if all of a sudden now, like British or Portuguese in this area, combine two uh, people groups who are enemies, and then all of a sudden they're making them live by each other and kind of go by these different rules? That's going to cause a lot of tension. Splitting up nations that were friendly and then putting together nations that were enemies without really an understanding of the culture of these different groups, and kind of arbitrarily deciding who gets what is what the Europeans did, is going to cause a lot of issues in Africa, especially with the people and their cultures kind of dividing and kind of rubbing together, in which they previously wouldn't have before the Europeans decided to come get involved. Look at boundaries. Boundaries are an invisible line marking the extent of a state's territory. So if you look at a map, you can see boundaries very clear. However, if you look from in space, you don't really see boundaries. These are going to be man-made, uh, determining how big or how small a country is or an area that they control. These are going to be very important when determining uh, who controls what resources somebody has, if it's in their country or not, and kind of saying what area of control that that nation has. So boundaries are going to be very important. Those are kind of boundaries that are man-made. They're not going to be necessarily seen from space. However, there are physical boundaries. Some people, when they're creating the boundaries of a country, they use physical boundaries to kind of help. So physical boundaries coincide with significant features of the natural landscape. Physical boundaries make good boundaries because they're easily seen both on maps and on the ground. So you could look at a desert. Desert boundaries are effective because they are hard to cross and sparsely inhabited. So if a country has kind of a nation around or a desert around their nation, it's going to be easily seen like, okay, if you go past this desert, you're not in our nation anymore. It's going to be very clear to whoever is there that this part is controlled by this nation. We're also going to see mountain boundaries also be very effective boundaries because they're difficult to cross. They're also difficult to cross and they're easy to see. So you could be like, our nation is going to be on this side of the mountains, yours is on the other side. It's very hard to navigate. So, like, if you were being attacked or something from the other nation, the mountains are hard to kind of do that from. So, it protects you that way. It is also easy to see where your nation boundaries end. So, these physical boundaries are very helpful when it comes to actually seeing in person or on a map where your nation's kind of doesn't have that authority over. Lastly, another physical boundary is waters. Rivers, lakes, oceans. These are very commonly used boundaries. They're very easily seen on a map. A river divides two nations is very common. Or even if you look in the United States, rivers dividing states, we're going to see that as well. For example, a lot of the southern, especially southern Minnesota and Wisconsin, are divided by the Mississippi. So we're going to see states be divided by water boundaries a lot, or like the coast is going to determine it, or some sort of lake is going to divide the two states or two nations. So we're going to see this issue or these physical boundaries really come into play, especially when they're very clear. They're oftentimes used as physical boundaries between states or between nations. So you have the regular boundaries that are put on place by humans, kind of creating arbitrarily where each country has control, but might not necessarily be a physical boundary between. And then you also have physical boundaries that allow you to easily see where the boundary between the two nations or two states are. You also have cultural boundaries. Two types of cultural boundaries follow the distribution of cultural characteristics. Two types of cultural boundaries are common: geometric and ethnic, and we'll get into those. Geometric are straight lines drawn on a map. Again, these are kind of arbitrary lines that are created, and you look at the picture, you see they're just created, and it's what splits between the United States and Canada is that straight line. We also see ethnic boundaries come into play between states and coincide with differences in ethnicity as well as language and religion. So an example of this would be like in Canada, you have the Quebec, which is French, primarily French-speaking province in Canada, and it's very you have the lines between, and you have the boundaries set based on ethnic kind of language and religion, and kind of looking at how that could divide. Uh, you don't see this necessarily in the United States per se, but in other nations where it's very clear where there's two different distinct cultures, there's a split between them based on those ethnicities rather than just arbitrary lines like a geometric boundary would be. So that's going to wrap up our talk on colonialism in Africa, as well as looking at boundaries of nations and of states and how they are drawn differently, and kind of looking at what are the different types of boundaries there are. So we talked about regular, just in general, what boundaries are. We looked at physical boundaries. We looked at geometric and ethnic slash cultural boundaries. We looked at all the different ways different nations are divided up and how they kind of determine those boundaries and how they know what is their control or what is not in their control in regards to how much influence they have over an area is based on their boundaries that are put in place. So you should be able to fill out your Learning Target guide on this section, and hopefully you have that done.